two before the one. Wisdom is water, I'm the daughter of the cannon fodder. Applied knowledge and insight, a born scholar. Look like a martyr to marauders like Tartar. Wise owl slaughter, whack MCs order applauder. Original woman, decipher the womb. Crown of creation, fruit of the planet, earth and the moon.
Peace, peace, peace. Welcome to another episode of Wise the Dome. Today I have another very special guest, someone I've been wanting to have on the show for a minute. He's an author, he's a researcher and man of the community. He's written several books. Most of you guys know him, Asar Imhotep. I appreciate you for coming through.
Peace and blessings, and thank you for having me, and peace and blessings to your audience. And thank y'all for joining us.
Indeed. All right, so let's start. I like to start from the beginning. What kind of sparked your interest in the study of ancient Kemet and African linguistics?
All righty. Well, the study of ancient Kemet came along as a result of coming out of the Hebrew Israelite tradition. And so, I was into Black history and stuff as a young child, but later on in my teenage years, I had joined what was then known as the Israeli Church of Universal Practical Knowledge, now known as the ISUPK.
Right.
And so coming into college, I began to dwayne on that, but then pick up Africana studies as, kind of a focal point in terms of research and history. And so, of course, when you in Africana studies, one of the main places that they concentrate on is ancient Kemet.
Right.
So it just was part of my larger Africana studies study.
Right.
Right. And then it just kind of got deeper from there. And in regards to the linguistic aspect, the more and more I kept delving into the essential arguments that a lot of scholars were making at that time in the late 90s and early 2000s, which were, at least for me, coming into that knowledge around this time, but they've been making these arguments prior,
right?
But just becoming aware of these detailed arguments on the racial identity of the ancient Egyptians, were they Africans or not, things of that nature, it kind of forced me to delve into the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic script. And then trying to understand this relationship to African people. The language bit just came naturally as a process of trying to research those questions in relationship to identity and things. So the work of, for example, Cheikh Anta Diop or Teofilo Benga, were kind of critical in that initial spark and phase, regarding the language and linguistics. And even before then, there were some local people like Brother Jabali Powell and, Professor James Smalls, Professor Smalls would come to Houston, but I was in Houston, Texas at the time. And so there was an organization there, several different organizations, but one in particular named Taseti African Historical Society. That's one of the things that they would kind of delve into. And, some of the elders that were in that organization, used to roll with and study under Dr. Ben.
Right.
So, even though they weren't necessarily into linguistics as deep as I am now, they emphasize the study of language.
Right.
And get into etymology to things. So this combination is kind of a perfect storm of things. And it just was an inevitable outcome that, I had to add historical linguistics to my academic toolbox.
Indeed. And so it kind of leads to my next question. How do you see the contributions of scholars such as Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga to the field of Black studies in general, not just Kemet, but Africana studies in general?
They are. I'm gonna start with Kemet because even though I'm an Afrocentrist in terms of my scholastic orientation, I'm going to say this reference just because I know that your audience can grasp it. But especially when it comes to ancient Egyptian studies, Theophilo Benga and Cheikh Anta Diop are the Wright brothers, of that field in terms of Africana studies, right? They're the first ones who, created the structure that allowed, us to fly to a certain point.
Right.
Now, of course, we know the first planes, only went so far, whatnot. But now we got, jet planes and rockets or whatnot. And we have the same thing with scholars now because they built off of what they have contributed in regards to ancient Egyptian studies. But now to bring it back to the larger point of your question, they were able to look at Africa as a whole and to ground the studies in ancient Egyptian, but to put that within the context of all of African history. And so we're getting a very broad look into the evolution, expansion, contractions, relationships, wars and things, and even the psychology of African people as a result of their studies. Now, for most of us here in the United States, we don't speak French, but there's a lot of work that these two have done that is currently written in French. And you will get a deeper understanding of their overall, goals and achievements if you look at it if you are able to get those French works. But, I don't want to, the reason why I started off in ancient Egypt, because I don't want to downplay other scholars that came before them on the front of African history itself. So when you talk about like people like W.B. Du Bois, Arthur Schomburg, of course, the late Dr. John Henry Clark and others, Higgins, and just a whole slew, Carter G. Woodson, all that, like they, and even before them on the African front, there's Anton Fernan and Martin Delaney, the first African American to be reading the hieroglyphs, here in the 1800s. And so, they kind of paved that way. But what sets Theophilo Benga and Cheikh Anta Diop apart from everyone else that I named is that they were from the continent. They spoke their native languages, and they were able to still live and see certain traditions where when they looked at the hieroglyphs and the scenery on the wall and understood the rituals and things, it's like, hey, we still do that here. Like I see this going on, around my way. And so they were able to, outside of the academic skill set in which they both possessed, they were able to bring a level of authenticity to the arguments that, unfortunately, because us in the diaspora, aren't on the continent, that they were able to bring that level of insight into. And so that kind of sparked just a new, wave of scholarship to this day.
That kind of, and so now two questions in regards to that.
Okay.
has there ever been any? All right, so we know how important Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophile Obenga are to our intellectual endeavors and Africology, Africana studies as a whole. Has there ever been any attempt to translate the French works into English?
Yes, we have a few of their works in English. For example, Cheikh Anta Diop's Civilizational Barbarism, Black
Yeah,
Africa, and
yeah, I
Economic and
have those.
Cultural
I have
Basis.
those. So those were originally written in French.
Yeah, all their
Okay,
works
okay,
were
okay.
originally. So if you have any of their works in
Mhm.
English, it was a translation. You
Gotcha.
know, like Theophile Obenga's, he has a Black Egypt as well
Mhm.
text, and his 2004 text, which was the African Philosophy, the Blue Book. You know, those were originally, you know, in French,
Mhm.
and so so hopefully we can get more, because they you know, they have so much more work in French than has
Right.
been translated in
Mhm.
English.
Right.
And so if we're and again, Obenga's unique because he is not only talking about ancient Egypt, like he has like works just on Bantu people in
Mm.
Central Africa and
Mhm.
cultures
Right.
that is very important to just the Africana study. So if we or trying to understand ourselves a little better, because of course Central Africa is, we always talk about West Africa, we think
Mhm.
about Nigeria and Ghana and Senegal and the Ivory Coast, of Cote d'Ivoire. But people keep forgetting Congo, you
Mm.
know,
Right.
and even on the Far East in terms of Mozambique
Indeed.
and Madagascar, you
Mhm.
know, like those people. So like when he ties those Central African and Southern African people together, you know, it helps to uh, better understand our history and some of the attitudes and some of the things that we bring here in the diaspora, especially coming from those regions.
Right.
So,
Well,
go
no,
ahead.
didn't mean to cut you. So at the UNESCO conference, right?
Mm-hmm.
What was done there, and does it still hold up today?
Alrighty. Well, several issues were addressed at the UNESCO conference in 1974. And so 72 or 74, I believe
I
it's
believe it was
74.
74, yeah. Mhm.
Um, the main thing that they were trying to bring to the broader academic discourse on ancient Egypt and African history in general was, how was ancient Egypt populated?
Mhm.
Who were the ancient Egyptians?
Mhm.
Were these people of inter-African, you know, native descent, or were these people migrants coming out of the Middle East?
Mhm.
And so the objective was to bring about, you know, up-to-date knowledge and information in an array of fields to answer that particular question. So whether we're talking about archaeology, whether you're talking about paleoanthropology, linguistics, cultural anthropology, of course, archaeology,
Mhm.
and the like. So whatever endeavor was, it was a multidisciplinary approach to the study of the peopling of ancient Egypt. So that was their focus. Were these people Africans? Were these people Black? You know, what are the arguments for and against? Let's
Mhm.
put it all on the table.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, we're starting to see a little progress,
Mhm.
just a little, in terms of being able to understand ancient Egypt. And I'm talking about in the sense of the broader mainstream
Right.
academic circles in these European Egyptological schools. The
Right.
African school been on it.
Right.
But uh but you're starting to see a little bit of admitting you know, in terms of the African origins, you know, of ancient Egypt and the like, even to the point of the Met Museum in New York, their current exhibition, you know, kind of comparing and showing, you know, concepts and motifs in ancient Egypt and in other parts of Africa, you know, from their collections and the like. So, you know, you see books written like Egypt in its African context, right? And these kind of essays and the like. But I'm also seeing a trend, however, because you know they're not going to give up give up without a fight.
Right.
So, you know, so now you're starting to see all of these DNA articles being written, but they're only sampling from areas with a high concentration of foreign elements.
Right.
Right. But then claiming the results represent all of Egypt for all its time.
Right.
And then you also got this other issue of what I'm starting to see now when it comes to the identity. Well, you know, the more and more evidence that ancient Egypt was initially a Black society with language and customs that relate to inner Africa. Now you're starting to see more and more articles and things written trying to make the argument that there really was no ancient Egyptian national identity, and it was a large mixed population, and there's evidence for that. But the question still remains: well, there has to be an initial matrix culture. Who were those people?
Right.
Who were the people that are being depicted on the walls?
Right.
You know, and why do they look so drastically different in their own artwork than what is parading right now as ancient Egyptians? I mean, excuse me, parading around now as native Egyptians. Now, it's humanly possible, and we got to be careful on how we approach this thing, because you can have a number of migrants over 3,000 years who are intermarrying and having children, and if there's such an extreme in terms of phenotypes over a 3,000 year period, that admixture and stuff will look a certain way that's a lot different than on its founding. And so we have to be able to acknowledge that, but at the same time, we also have to look at the evidence for how the people looked, how they carried themselves, their thought processes, and see who do they cluster with. More. Do these people cluster more with people in the Middle East, or do they cluster more with people in Central and Eastern Africa, for example, right? And that's the kind of research that I've been involved in the past 20 years, looking at that model. But so there's a little progress in one end, but they're not going to give up Egypt, without a fight. And so this is the kind of thing that we deal with. So they're trying to make it more ambiguous in terms of, who they are and the like. And this is one of the reasons why, not to be long-winded, that I've started, I'm in the beginning phases of developing an entirely new discipline that I call Into Com. And Into Com is the study of ancient Egypt within its larger, what I call Into context. And, several scholars, including myself, have looked at an array of African languages, including the ancient Egyptian, and we have argued and are arguing that what we're calling Bantu languages today, it actually was the original of this larger family that Theophilo Benga calls Negro Egyptian, Jean-Claude Mboli calls Negro Egyptian, but what I call Shin and Intu. And so it's a very complicated argument, but the essence of what we call Intu is that larger proto-culture. And so it's a study of ancient Egypt in its into context. And the orientation of the study is the Nile River itself. So the discipline not only studies ancient Egypt per se, but of course the Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Uganda, all the way down to the Great Lakes. And to understand the geography, the fauna, the archaeology, the genetic movements, linguistic movements, all of that there. Because in the mainstream Egyptology, or just Egyptology in general, even when you go to the university, they put it in the Near Eastern studies.
Right.
And so their orientation is in the Middle East, and to an extent, the whole Mediterranean. And it is our argument that you really won't understand ancient Kemet, its psychology, its expressions, its motifs, its form of kingship and the like, until you study and link it with these people along the Nile, all the way, down.
Right. And
go ahead, I'm sorry.
And so, no, indeed. And is there any evidence of any of the ancient and any of the deities in ancient Kemet coming from other places from the south or the interior?
That's kind of it's yes and no, in the sense that let's say a yes. I argue that Osiris comes directly out of Nubia, Sudan, right? But like other concepts of deity or whatnot is really just part of the whole family itself. Right. So the problem is that it's not necessarily a problem, but it's a misunderstanding for those who are not necessarily knowledgeable about linguistics and the like, is that the names of these deities, many of them, you'll find all over Africa. However, you may not recognize them, right? And so, for example, one that you might recognize, we know the god Amen, right? Amen is still worshipped is Imani in like Uganda, Kenya area there, right? It's also in West Africa. Like Amen is all over Africa in general. But you may know it as Nzambi or Nzambini in places like West Africa and Central Africa and Njambe. It's where you get the word zombie from, right? So of course they demonize the African concept of spirit,
right?
And zombie. So they make horror movies out of it, just kind of like how they did the Mummy,
right?
Movie, made him
a villain, right?
Exactly. So, but Ra itself is also in like, for example, Central Africa as the god Kalunga, right? And the root being Lunga. We say Ra, but that's not really how it's pronounced. Matter of fact, Ra may really, at least in its initial ancient Egyptian form, was closer to the pronunciation of Yoruba or Orisha.
Wow.
And so that's another problem that we have, is what we don't know the exact vocalization, for example, of Old and Middle Egyptian. We have Coptic, but this is so many years later, and they lost certain phonemes, by this time, and there's lots of sound changes and the like. So, the way that we pronounce like Amen and Ra and Ma'at, that's not how it was pronounced in these languages. And what's interesting is that the word Ra, the word Ma'at, and even the word, some people say the Aku, you know, which is a mispronunciation. All three of them are the same word.
Wow.
With different dialectical variations of the same word.
Wow.
Right. It's kind of hard to see, but when you line them up and do linguistics, you'll be able to see those things. So like there's another variation. As a matter of fact, Kalunga is Ma'at as well, you know, in because it's cognate with Ra, but we can also show that it's cognate with Ma'at. And so in Kikongo, they say Kalunga, but in some of the East African languages, they say Malunga or Munu, right? So this is closer to the Ma'at in terms of the M prefix that's on the root. But the Collagen people, they don't have a deity named Ma'at, but they have a social system, Ma'at, right? And the Collagen people have an oral history of existing in ancient Egypt, and then during Ptolemaic and Greek times, because of certain wars and things, they migrated south, and just over the years, they went through Sudan, went through Uganda, and ended up in Kenya, but still traces, you know, all along that strip. As a matter of fact, it was the subject of Dr. Kipkowicz Arap Sambu's PhD dissertation. So he is a Collagen by ethnicity and by birth, and he grew up hearing these stories. And you know, so he set out to do an oral history examination and recording from a lot of the old elders that were still living. This is from the early 90s. So of course these people close in their 80s and 90s, born in the early 1900s. And so the collagen way of life was still, you know, ripe and prevalent then. And so it's a good thing that he was able to capture that, and then to go into the ancient Egyptian scripts and stories and to see certain things and to make certain proofs. So that was his PhD dissertation. He created 2 works out of it. And so, you know, and even for example, like I mentioned Asar or Osiris or Osir. So among the Luo people, it's just a common name. Like you'll still find people named Osir in terms of their either their surname or that's just their name. Right. And it has to deal with somebody who was of good character, stand-up dude, somebody who's a pillar of their home. Right. And but what's interesting is that word is cognate with, for example, in Chiluba, we have Nkole, right? And Nkole is a word that is used for an imminent or a powerful person, right? And it is also used for God itself. And when you say the Ba Nkole, that means the spirits of the ancestors, right? It's in the plural. Both of those words are cognate with the word nature.
Oh, wow.
So in the Central African form, it is not, the K is not palatalized. So when it does palatalization, that what we're talking about is how the sound from the back, you know, is now pronounced towards the front of the mouth near the palate, you know. So the velars that are in the back, now you're saying like you know, in netcher. Right. And so from the netcher, you can also that ch, because now it's in the front. Others will pronounce it as either sh or s. So that's how you get Osir from that. And but in other of the, for example, collagen languages, that seer is pronounced chi. You know, so it's the issue isn't really necessarily like, do they worship the gods from ancient Egypt? Like, did they migrate? They all inherited these deities from or this conceptualization of deity from their ancient ancestors, that ancestral culture, that when they began to create communities and spread out and travel, it just remained with them. And this is Osir over here. Like Osir in among the Yoruba is the god Eshu. But Eshu is conceived a little bit differently than Osir in the amongst the ancient Egyptians. But they're the same word. And there's we can demonstrate that and prove that linguistically. Right.
Wow.
And it's just the way that the word nature, like in some communities, it will represent just the divine powers, the spirits in general. But in another, it's like the name for God. Right.
Wow. Right.
And so it's even like that among like the ancient Egyptians, where there's something to be a lower deity there, that name and that concept will be the main deity amongst another African community. So this is why I like the work of Cheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga and even others, Muba Benge Bololo, Om Ndiji, Abubakar Musalam, right? Jean-Claude Mboli, Modube Odioye, Dr. Kipkowicz and Rob Sambu, who I just mentioned, like all of these people and more, are allowing for us to see the greater picture and the greater relationships. So we don't have to look at ancient Egypt as some kind of isolation.
Right.
And then the studies help us to explain the fascination for people in the diaspora with ancient Egypt, because it's the same concepts from your native ancestors. You don't have to go all the way to ancient Egypt if you want to worship Osir or the Netshers and whatnot. You just find the equivalent in these local traditions, and you see how they're still doing or associating and conceptualizing these divine concepts, in these living communities. And that's what we hope to help, kind of bridge that gap for people trying to understand, African cultures and worldviews.
Indeed. And so what are some, you kind of touched on some earlier, but whenever we're dealing in mainstream academia, whether we're just, readers and researchers or, people that put out research papers and books, whenever we're dealing with and you said that you approach things from an Afrocentric perspective. I do as well, right? And there's not so I know that at one point in the YouTube or online community, a lot of people were giving flack to the idea of Afrocentricity. They probably need to read Malefi Asante's book on that. But at the same time, it is, I view Afrocentricity as our way of centering ourselves in our work within Africana studies, or just our worldview, how we raise our families, our being, right? Whenever we look at mainstream academia, it is centered in whiteness. It might not be a name for it, right?
Yeah. It
is the default. And so I remember whenever I was young, I was at a summer camp. It was like a Pan-African summer camp. And we had a speaker come, and so I'm 43 now, so I was young. So this is back in the day, but I had a speaker come, and he was talking about ancient Egypt, and he was showing the bias and approaches of mainstream Egyptology at that time. And there was a textbook from, I guess, the university that he went to that said Africa and Egypt, implying that Egypt is not a part of Africa, right? Whenever we engage in Black studies, for whatever reason we engage them in, and we begin to see things and when I say see things from a Black perspective and see things from an Afrocentric idea, I am not advocating making things up and making everybody in the world Black, right? That's not what we're doing. We're engaging in, in real study and research. But with that said, what are some misconceptions about ancient Kemet, and how do you address them in your research?
Well, you mentioned one of the big ones, and that is that Egypt is not in Africa. And this is something that Zahi Hawass tries to argue. They want to make it seem like, for example, not just Egypt, but just North Africa is its own continent. Right, like it's like sub-Saharan Africa is a continent, and then there's North Africa that's another continent, right? And Egypt doesn't belong into it has no relation to sub-Saharan Africa, right? So, first we always got to correct folks in terms of geography, and even if they have relations with people in the Levant, in the Middle East, and Europe, it's still in Africa, right? And so now you're gonna have to either redefine what a continent is, or find some other way to move the goalposts when we're dealing with this. But so that's one major misconception in terms of a lot of academics, right? Which is again explains why they put it in Near Eastern studies in terms of Africa, because they're trying to lift the whole country and put it in the Middle East. And even the Middle East concept doesn't even make sense. Like that's not even a place, right? But on the side of the Africans who are coming to know ancient Kemet, and they try to over mysticize the culture, right? And one of the ways in which they do that is by assuming like the language itself was this super sacred language that came directly from the gods. And if you learn the meta nature, that somehow you'll be on this higher level of consciousness. And it's like, no, it's just a human language like any other language. And this language is just a dialect of a parent language, but it's just a sister language to many African languages. So the same concepts and words that you would find in ancient Egypt, you find all over Africa. So if when you talk about the Neteru, well, the Akan and the Asante, they have Intoro, right? The airway throw, right? It's Intoro among the Songo in Central Africa. Amongst the Bantu speakers, they have Nkole and Nkola, those variations, of the word, right? So there's nothing super sacred, because you'll bypass all these other African groups that have the essence of what you're trying to study there, but you don't find them of value. So you can't study ancient Egypt in isolation, which is one of the reasons why when we do these studies of ancient Egypt, we always are putting it within a larger African context, because it belongs to a family of languages. And of course, the language is just the verbal encapsulation of thought, for a group. And if they're sharing the same language, often they'll share the major aspects of culture. And so when you see these things like the leopard skin, garments that you'll find priests and kings wearing all over Africa, including ancient Egypt. Why do we find
We have
the
whole
leopard
leopard
and cheetah
society,
skins.
whole leopard
You know,
societies in West Africa. The
exactly.
right?
And that word is the same word. It's just a dialectical variation of the word for leopard in ancient Egypt.
Mm.
So how is all of this the case? That's what you gotta study and do the scientific analysis and make these links, because it's not isolated. They're part of a larger culture. Mm-hmm. So it's no different than there's African American culture, but it's kind of different out here in Philly where I'm at, right, than in New York, mm-hmm, versus LA, mm-hmm, versus Houston. Right. Their own little nuances. But right, we can go anywhere across the United States and vibe just as fine. Exactly. Right. Because we have enough commonality that we recognize each other, mm-hmm, when we see. We recognize a similar experience when we go to anywhere, New Orleans to Atlanta, right, wherever, right? Wherever we are, that's where we are, right? So, that's one thing. And we kind of touched on the gods and goddesses, earlier. Like people don't understand that the gods and goddesses, for the most part, are not conscious living beings like you and I, that you can hold a conversation with, right, and debate and and they do this and they get angry. You got to understand deities in the context of African pedagogy. They represent concepts and values that the community deems important to pass on to posterity. And so the way that we teach is orally. Right. Even if you see it written in stories written in ancient Egypt, the primary transferring mechanism is oral tradition and acting, right? And ritual, like it's ingrained. And so you personify the concept, and then you center stories around it so that the listener, the person growing up and learning, understands the relationship that this particular idea is supposed to have in their life. Right. And sometimes they create models for behavior. So if you have an Osiris and you have an Aset, for example, remember Osiris has to deal with somebody who is a pillar, right? Someone who is of good character and good governance. So all of his stories center around that, even to the point of when he becomes the ruler of the underworld, the Duat, he, you meet him after the judgment, after you've been judged, Ma'keru, true of voice. And what do you have to do to be considered true of voice? You have to confess that you have not done or violated any of the community taboos. Wow. And not only that, you have to tell us what you did do. So you had that, and these admonitions to Ma'at is what we call them, right? Stuff that still goes on in Central Africa, right? Right. And so I've fed the hungry. I have given a boat to somebody who was boatless, right? I have not, and that's the stuff that I've done. I have not robbed. I have not slept with someone else's wife. I have not raised my voice. So when you have demonstrated that you are a person of high character, then you meet Asar and you get the name Asar attached to your name.
Like kind of how you said of that group today with the name Osir.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
And so in that community, it's just an everyday name for folks. Right. But in ancient Egypt, you would only get that name if, after you've died and you become associated, now you have proven. So what the word essentially means is that this is a person that we can rely on, that we can lean on like a wall, like a pillar, like a tree, and not fall.
Right.
So that they created a model because this is the kind of character this is the kind of person that our community has come together and created a culture to develop this type of human being. And we need to give them a model to emulate. So we personify that concept of good character, of reliability, being a person of your word, being somebody who is generous and a critical thinker and a good leader. We kind of call that Osir. Right?
Right.
So this happens all across Africa. So it's not that you need to worship and put some sacrifices, out to the deities. It's not that many African communities that actually do that. The Yoruba is one of them, for example. But you won't find that as great in Central Africa. So there's no one way to be African.
Right.
And that's another thing that we have to understand, even when we're studying ancient Egypt. So we don't have to try to link everything that they do to all of Africa.
Right.
There's things that they do that is unique to them. And there's certain things that the Yoruba do that's unique to them, and the Bakongo, etc. But there's immense commonality between these related folks.
Indeed, man. And so kind of getting back to linguistics and language, can you tell us how language or the role of language is in shaping cultural and historical narratives of Africa? Because this is not just, I guess, about ancient Kemet, but ancient Kemet obviously could possibly be used as an example with the information that you just gave. Whenever we look at mainstream academia, you mentioned that in a lot of cases, they won't even go into Southern and Central Africa and look at ancient Kemet in the context of it being an African society. With that said, what is the role of language in shaping the historical narrative of Africa?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that it has a role in shaping. That's a debate that is ongoing in linguistics in general.
Okay.
Right. Does the language shape the culture or reverse?
Right.
Right. And I'm of the opinion that it's really more so the culture. The language just encapsulates it concretizes, the ideas in people's heads, right? And it allows them to transfer from your head to someone else's head, right? But the values and the thought process is what is first, right? And then we try to find a word that represents that, and then we try to build community and create relationships centered around that. So I think it's more so the culture. Now, how we express certain things may be unique in the kind of language that we use. For example, I don't know how to say it in Chinese, but when they greet each other, the words that they use for their greeting essentially ask the question, have you eaten today? Right? And contrast that with hello in English. Right. We don't really know what that means. We just know it's a greeting, but we don't know what hello, at least I don't know what hello means right off the top of my head. It's not something that it's not a word that we use in everyday, just common discourse, I should say. Right. But think about that for a moment. When we greet each other in Chinese, asking the question, have you eaten today? Right? So they're at one point, I don't know what they're 1 billion people now. If this, the attitudes are the same, if it's gotten to the point of just, you know, common courtesy. It's kind of like how we ask how you doing. We really don't care,
Right.
but you know, we just want to know if you're all right, you know. And so but in the early days, you know, there was a care and concern about, you know, your energy, your health, or whatnot. So before we can even engage in anything, have you eaten today?
Yeah, that's real. Yeah.
You
And
know
you
what I'm
can see
saying?
how over time that the essence of that meaning may just become you know, has less is, you know, the further from the root it goes, the less it stays the same. It just something that we say now. But yeah, like back in the day, that more than likely was a way that culturally they took care of each other, you know.
Exactly. So you can tell that they had a real communal sense of identity and engaging with each other. And you find similar things in Africa, like when you go into Central Africa amongst the Baluba people, and even amongst the isiZulu, the word, well, how should I say? The word moyo, like you see this word here, kimoyo. I don't know if it's gonna be backwards or not.
Nah, I think right.
But the word moyo in kimoyo is a word for heart, literally. But it has expanded meanings of spirit, of life, vitality, and a host of other things. But it's also used as a greeting. And so the idea is that when I'm greeting you, I'm sending you a blessing of life and vitality. It's almost like when you say Ankh Uja Sened, you know, to the king in ancient Egypt. You know, you're sending someone vital force, and they're exchanging. So we're exchanging vital force just by meeting each other.
Wow,
right. And so on that level, it's a deeper, how should I say, a more philosophical, you know, concept of community. You know, so now we're getting into some deep cosmology and mind, you know, when these African people were meeting. And when it comes to Kikongo and the isiZulu, this word Munga, which I mentioned before, is cognate with Ma'at. They greet each other with that.
Wow.
And the same thing amongst the Caucasian, but they say Mat, M-A-A-T. So the Bantu is more aligned to the original pronunciation of the word. And then the Caucasian has this evolved form where the two consonants have essentially dropped or became vowels. And so that's why they say Mat. But in amongst the Bantu is Mulungu, Mulungu, things like that, right? But this idea of health and balance, I'm sending that to you because I want nothing but the best for you. So that's what I wish you. I send you blessings. So this is how we greet each other. You know, versus, you know, what's up, my nigga?
Yeah. But you know but when you say that though, it's like that's a great idea to just sit there and think about. It's like for me, especially because like linguistics isn't my you know, my field of study or anything like that, but I also understand that it is part of the bigger picture of the human experience, and whenever we're studying about ourselves, a part of the African experience. And it seems that you can tell a lot about the values of a culture, whether it's present day or, you know, back in the day in antiquity. But you can tell about a lot of the values of a culture by the words they use, and the point that you just made, even down to the greetings, right? Like, how do we greet each other? If if those same people that you spoke about who greet each other in a manner of "Have you eaten today?" or "Mat," and however that breaks down in their language, if you told them that, like you said, that we greet each other like, what's up, my nigga? And you break it down on what it means, they're like, they kind of messed up over there. You know what I'm saying? Like what's going on over there? So that's something I'm definitely going to take with me and think more about. Um, whenever whenever it comes to ancient Kemet, what do you think are some of the most significant contributions that ancient Kemet has made to human civilization?
Well, one of their greatest contributions is their writing system.
Mm.
And, I know there's debates between certain folks on did the Sumerians create writing or did the ancient Egyptians create writing first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really irrelevant in the sense that the ancient Egyptians had more impact with their writing.
Mm-hmm.
Because not only did the ancient Egyptians come up with different scripts throughout their history, the hieroglyphs is responsible for the Canaanite language, the Canaanite script that became the Hebrew script.
Wow.
And the ancient Greek script and the Roman script that we use today. So even when you're looking at your keyboard, many of these forms originate with the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Wow.
Right. And there's been whole studies done on the impact. And matter of fact, Dr. Theophilo Benga has an article showing all the scripts that originate from the hieroglyphs. So there's a lot more in that area that adopted the script.
Right.
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 And so, that is a major contribution unto itself. But there's still there's medical concepts and things that, was been passed on, even in terms of architecture, like there's the columns, right? And even the true pyramids and things of this nature. It's like certain things dealing with astronomy and of course in mathematics.
Mm-hmm.
And just even in sense of style for a lot of folks, right? Even the influence, for example, with the Osirian drama and its influence amongst the Hebrews for their Jesus story.
Right.
Like, so Christianity itself is ultimately traceable to, ancient Kemet, not in all of its details, but in its major in terms of the Christ aspect. So without Jesus, there's no Christianity. And that is a concept that was built off of the model of Osiris. And so there's just many things that we just kind of owe, to ancient Egypt. And, they existed in a time and a place that just allowed for them to explore and expand on things and to keep records. Unlike in other places that, until the invention, they created paper.
Right.
So we even say paper because it comes from papyrus, right? So you couldn't do that necessarily in Central Africa, even though they had trees. It would be not with the kind of tools that they had to be able to chop down a tree and then, make it into, that wouldn't come till hundreds of thousands of years later. But because the dry environment, they're preserved things longer than for example, in a rainforest. So there's certain farming things. Like even in West Africa, for example, you know, like we look at cowrie shells,
Right.
and we automatically think West Africa, and you know, they got it on all kinds of artwork, and some of us used to wear cowrie shells back in the day, right? But they come from Egypt. And it was a currency that was had back in the day. So that's how them because cowrie shells don't exist naturally in West Africa. They exist in Egypt and along the Red Sea. Wow. So this was the currency that came that way, right? So, you know, they were a major player back in the day, and we owe a lot to them, you know. Indeed. Even indirectly, because, you know, people like the Romans and the Greeks have built off of what they initiated, you know, being more in direct contact with them. And then, you know, it expands from there.
Indeed. And so you personally, you know, matter of fact, I'll take it back to this, in Job's African Origin of Civilization. You know, he talks about, you know, different, I guess, different pseudosciences at, you know, in one time that were used to create a narrative about, you know, who the fathers of civilization were, right? You know, he talks about Piltdown Man and others. And in 2023, obviously they probably can't do it to that extent anymore. But obviously there's always going to be human bias within a lot of these fields. Just like AI, I'm in tech. I mean, sometimes it's gonna be inherent biases of the programmer within it. But at the same time, how do you personally approach your research and studying the history of a culture that has been systematically distorted in mainstream narratives?
Again, we're going to have to go back to Afrocentricity. And, you know, regardless to what people are thinking, there's really kind of two dimensions to this. There is the academic dimension, and then there's the applied dimension within the lives of African people.
Like more of like a cultural type of Afrocentricity.
Exactly, right? So this is for people wanting to get back into their African selves. And so we build off of the information from the academic side. But the academic side, you know, stresses first and foremost that when we're dealing with any kind of culture, right? The culture, the people who were born into the culture and live the culture and speak the language, their perspective about the world and the culture is priority, right? That's what it means to be centered. You're taking their word in terms of how the underpinnings of the culture is. Right. And if they happen to be African people, you have to be centered in those African people to tell the story. You can't just come and look at them and be like, you know, well, I think this is what da-da-da. It's like, no, what you think is irrelevant. It's what do they think? What do they understand and know? So you tell it from the perspective of the people on the ground regarding their culture and how they interact in the world, right? And so when it comes to these distortions, that's the first place that I go. It's to the people themselves. Right. You look at the oral traditions and then look at the languages, right? And really get a sense of, and it's hard. You as a human being, it's hard to be objective. Right. But you have to place yourself as part of the community and to exist within it and to look from that perspective versus an outsider. Now you can mention, yourself as an outsider. Methodically, I would give their insight and then give my insight as an outsider. So they're parallel. Right. I don't speak for them. Matter of fact, there's this African proverb, I forgot where it is exactly, the origin of it, but it says, never bleat in the place of a goat when it is present. Or never, bleat when a goat is present. So the goat can speak for itself. That's one of the reasons why the late, Ankh Mira wrote his hieroglyphic learning text. Let the ancestors speak. Meaning let them speak for themselves. Go to the script themselves and see what they're saying about their lives. Right. And so, what's happening, a lot of Eurocentrists, they don't understand African languages and customs and the like. And so they try to impose a kind of a Eurocentric analysis on these and just be all kinds of wrong. Right.
I want to ask you this. It kind of, before I lose my train of thought, does that happen when mainstream academia looks at ancient Egyptian deities and looks at them like maybe from an Abrahamic perspective, as this must be how they saw the Neteru, because this is how we see, Abrahamic prophets or Abrahamic gods. Do you think that happens?
Yes, I know it happens. And, this is one of the things that we try to avoid when doing that. Again, this is why the linguistics is really imperative. It is one of those tools that you just can't, as an academic researcher on Africa, especially in ancient Egypt, you really can't do a serious analysis without it. Right. Right. Because then it becomes guesswork. Because a lot of these concepts and things that people don't live the culture today. Right. So you only have the written testimony of the extant literature. But the way that you attack it is in conversation with living African cultures and languages, right? And that's when you get the insight, and when you understand, for example, African pedagogy, African sense of familyhood, that you can understand the Neteru, the Intoro, right? If you understand words for, like I'm working, well, I'm outlining right now, but I intend to write a book. It kind of building off of my 2016 book on the kingship, but I'm just going to be focused on leadership. And part of the conversation is on the titles of how we interpret kings and queens. Right. Like the words for like queens and kings do not translate the same in English. You can't call that person a king.
It reminds me of the Woman King movie. Like that was so like, you know what I mean? It's not African centered in how we would explain that. But go ahead.
And like when you think about the Kendaki or the Candaces of Nubia, right? So when you see you meet a girl, her name is Candace. It comes from that. That's actually an African name. Wow. Right. Right. Now, when you read the literature, they'll interpret the word as queen. But a queen is simply the wife of a king. This is not the case when it comes to Kendaki. And I remember somebody, I was at a Nile Valley 2 conference in Atlanta, Georgia. I think it was in like 2011. And, scholars from around the world there. There was a professor out of the Sudan who was informing us that the word means a pure woman. in terms of her character and the like. And it's interesting because I'm finding, not in terms of cognates, but in terms of the similarity in labeling in the Great Lakes region amongst Bantu speakers, that it's a class of women leaders where the word for that office translate essentially to like a pure woman, woman of good character. So now and they're cognate. Now these words are cognate with the word in ancient Egyptian Nefer, like in Nefertiti. Now the usual interpretation is that it'll say like the beautiful one has come. But I don't think that's a right interpretation. It's more so the pure of heart, it's more along the sense of purity in terms of character, one has come, instead of just kind of beauty in terms of physical. That's what they're thinking. But in Africa, character is beautiful. And so they're dealing with the nature of her, again, of her character. Like, character is so essential in Africa that the kings, the so-called kings, a lot of them, they're labeled as such from a word that has to deal with upright character, because they're telling you what is expected of you in this office. And like there's I forgot the phrase that's in Kikongo. It's a title for a leader among the Bakongo people, and it translates into a holder of the community's equilibrium. Right. Like, think about that. Like, you can't say king. He's the holder of the community's equilibrium.
That's deep. That's deep. Yeah, it's also and see, that's the beautiful thing about, I guess, going into that and understanding linguistics the way you do, is because, again, you can see culturally, like you said, linguistics is an expression, language is an expression of one's culture. And you can see culturally, like, whether they're still there or not to this day, because things change over time. A lot of times get westernized, depending on, the effects of colonialism and slavery and things of that nature. But you can see the essence of the culture within the language, and the fact that they saw their leaders, right, in this manner, go so far beyond just the idea of calling somebody a king or a queen, right, or whatever that means.
Yeah, it's so. This is why it's deep. You start to, one of the benefits of studying not only the languages, you don't necessarily have to be fluent, but if you can pick a language, get some dictionaries, get a grammar, and just read text written by them, and they'll introduce concepts in their native language, right? You get a deeper sense of the psychology. And now when we're talking about becoming African-centered, like, to become African-centered, ultimately, in my opinion, you really have to study a lot of African people, so that you can see what the commonalities are between these groups. And then you can understand what it means when we say that it is African, because this is something that we find, like a reverence for elders and ancestors and ritual and musicality and rhythm and proverbs in terms of holders of wisdom, and the like these are common everywhere. Mask and the like these things help to create a larger framework from which to understand these related groups. And then when you just get nerdy and academic, and the linguistics tells you, well, okay, the Yoruba and the Wolof and the ancient Egyptians and the Bakongo and the isiZulu and the Kalajan, et cetera, they all share the same ancestral culture.
Right.
You know,
You see that link, right?
You see the link. You're able to, on a scientific level, you know, make these kinds of connections. And that's the beauty of it. You really get a sense of what it means to be human.
Right.
In the greatest sense. And that's what we're kind of lacking. And sometimes you can find, like I was reading a text by an author by the name of Jordan Ngubani.
Okay.
And it's called A Conflict of Minds. And although the text is written in English, he's an Amazulu, or he was, he has since passed away, but this was published in 1979, and he is of the Zulu people, right?
Okay.
And although he written in English, because he still spoke his language, his native language, he wrote in a way that mirrored the language itself. Right. So when he's introducing concepts and a framework, after reading that text, I finally found the language that I needed to articulate certain aspects of even our reality here in the diaspora, right, or how we needed to word what, you know, we really mean, because we are kind of imprisoned by a language that doesn't come, you know, attached to a human-centered culture, right? Like the isiZulu, like the Bakongo, the Baluba, et cetera, et cetera. So even trying to articulate points, you know, about ourselves here in English, it doesn't have the same weight. It doesn't have the same impact. It doesn't articulate it as best as what I find on the continent in terms of, you know, matter of fact, this is one of the reasons why, like, I'm getting ready to, you know, kind of introduce this concept called Jashe, right? And this is me reconceptualizing hip hop culture.
Yeah, I saw some you doing that a little bit already.
Yes, and the issue is, like, we don't understand the depths of as African Americans, our association with vitality and power, right? And how this need, so if you can imagine, like, life is just a kind of fluttering equilibrium, right? But every now and then there's this jolt of energy, which the Yoruba call Ashe. So that totally disrupts that harmony, but in a good way. Right. So this is why when we go to a party and it was a really good party, we say stuff like, you know, I may be dating myself, you know, that it was off the hook. It was off the chain. You know, or it was lit. Or it was the bomb. Like, why do we have to go to these extremes to talk about the impact? Because we need words to talk about this jolt of power that was manifest in that. So that's why when you know, this is kind of even associated with spiritual possession, right? And like, I was reviewing, like, I just posted something on Facebook, you know, about the movie Rise. Right. If you remember that,
I remember
that documentary.
It was the dance. That's the dance movie, right?
Yes. And so it was a documentary about, you know, the beginnings and the origins, essentially, of crump dancing. And like, you just hear the people articulating, like, I was sitting there like, I wish I was on the set so I can tell you what you're trying to describe. This is what it's called in Africa. And so this whole concept of even hip hop and culture, like, like hip hop is just a manifestation of African American culture, which is built off of this concept of what I call kimoyo. So I have this overarching thing called kimoyo, and then there's hip hop culture, which I'm calling jashe. So it's ashe manifesting itself in these different art forms. So when there's a clip that I always show of KRS-One talking about hip hop is not, because we know the four basic elements of hip hop: graffiti, DJ and MCing, and b-boy, breakdancing, right? And he says hip hop is not those things. Hip hop is the attitude, the behavior, the consciousness that produces those things.
Right.
And I take that, and I'm saying that it's this idea associated with this ashe that manifests itself. It has to express itself in these creative forms. And so we say jashe, because I'm playing off of the term jazz, because hip hop ultimately comes from jazz, and it's a pathway to street jazz, you know, the marching band stuff, funk, then hip hop, right? So I'm taking it back to jazz because jazz is an African word. In Yoruba, you would say jasi for a party.
Oh wow, okay,
right. You know, and so a jazz is just really a party.
Yeah, no, they mentioned that in the history of jazz. I have it down there somewhere that it being an African word.
Yes. So I'm linking all of this, and I'm trying to put a framework so that all these things that we think are loose are really tied together in a way that it makes sense.
Right.
So, you know, like when we talk about MCing, right, it's really this concept that we call a afauche, afauche in Yoruba. And this is the ability to create events via the spoken word, right? To have an authority. In matter of fact, in ancient Kemet, we call it heka, right? An authoritative utterance or hue, right? You know, an authoritative utterance that, you know, whatever I speak comes into existence. Now, I remember, I don't know if you remember a DVD, and it was called the MC, and this is back when, you know, Q, what's his name?
QD3, the beef demon.
Yeah, so he had the beef series, and then he had the MC series. I think he had a graffiti one too. But in the MC documentary, KRS-One is kind of breaking down the 1979 Rapper's Delight.
Yeah, Rapper's Delight.
And he's talking about, you know, I have a link in Continental, and as you know, and whatever Cadillac it is, he starts naming all this stuff. He's like, they didn't have any of that stuff. But that speaks to the power. It's like we speak it into existence. And this is why, like, folks who don't have nothing in hip hop always talk about what they go have and what they have, because it's just the power. But then they, because of their art, they end up getting it, because they're speaking this stuff into existence, right? And that's always been a part of the culture, which is why we have such a disdain for like the gangster rap and the trap music and stuff, because you're bringing that death and destruction into your sphere.
Then we see that with Tupac, as much as he talked about death, right?
Exactly. And he talking about, you know, I never went to jail before. Biggie named his album Ready to Die.
Yeah.
You know, so what are you saying? And I remember, I think in that same DVD, Raekwon was like, that's why I don't play. Name of my, you know, because we just don't do that, because we understand that if we say it, you know, it creates that spirit. And this is why, you know, in the greater Kimoyo tradition of African spirituality, why when we greet each other with blessings. We send life to one another because we understand the role of our voice in creating, our reality. And so, I'm have a whole campaign on this. And, hopefully I'll be convincing the folks and they can see the linkages between these concepts. But, we have to use words like hip hop and DJing and MCing, all right, for
really
these
behind it.
It's really the spirit behind it. And we just don't have the words in the English language to encapsulate what is really going on in what we are doing.
Wow, that's brilliant. Because I saw some of the things that you were showing, but to hear the breakdown, oh man, that makes so much more sense, man. I saw the one on martial arts. And I thought it was, I thought it was brilliant because you even added chess in there, right? Which is warfare of the mind. I was like, yo, that's dope.
Because in the final analysis, like Joshe essentially is the objective of Joshe is to accomplish Ajashe. Now that's a whole word in Yoruba, and it means victory after much difficulty. And so when you go into Afrocentricity, you know that Dr. Asante and Almazama and others, they always stress having a victorious consciousness.
Right.
And this is what these are the 5 elements that I call them for the DJ and all that, including the martial arts, Eshegun. All of these are universities to train you to ultimately have a skill set as well as a victorious consciousness. That's what Afoshe is victory after much difficulty.
Wow.
And these are the ways that you achieve it. And so each and every single university, which is these elements that we all know and love, train you a little bit to attack life and to be able to tower over its 1001 challenges. Right. And so you have to be creative. That's where the musicality comes into play. Right. Learning how to build a community. You got to know the harmony. What does it mean to be in harmony? So when you're in a marriage or when you're in living in a community, what does it mean for everybody to play their part and to live harmoniously? You can take examples from music itself, right? Learning how to play instruments, the DJ, the band, whatever, production and the like. And there's other kinds of science that you can teach from that as well.
Right. And be able to apply these to our community life.
Exactly. And of course, just like you mentioned with the martial arts. So the official martial arts of Eshegun is 52 blocks, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, capoeira, and chess, right? And people will be like, chess, how's that a martial art? It's teaching you how to critically think, how to plan ahead, how to defend yourself intellectually. And Wu-Tang and chess and hip hop like that, it just goes together, right? So and then with the graffiti, so that is called Iyashe. So it's Ashe, as expressed through visual art. So the word Ya itself means to draw, to paint, to whatever. Right. And so Iyam is just a nominal form of that verb, right? So it's the Iya She. And so Ashe expressed through those things. But when it comes to, if you're owning a business, how to market, right? In terms of logos, how to creatively, how to decorate your home, how to, make your home essentially even African-centered to express itself, to see in different colors, but then it all goes back to the harmony. What colors go together? What else can you say visually? Using visual arts, just like what the Africans did in regards to what we're now calling today the law of attraction. So what does it mean like for me to draw my future?
You know,
and
that
then the
kind
work to manifest what I drew.
that
In the same way that a fauché, you know, you manifest what you speak.
that reminds me of like the Asogbo art movement in Nigeria in the 60s, right? Like being able to reclaim your culture through art. And in its many forms. Man, that's what sparked this to even come up with all of this, G? Like where did this come from, man?
I don't know. It just came to me one day. Like we need to, because I'm always about like I don't want to be simply a regurgitator of history.
I knew you was gonna say
right.
that too. Right.
I'm looking, okay, well, how can I use all this information, this 20 plus years of research in terms of African studies and language and utilize the essence in a modern form? And then looking at the circumstance of African Americans, and I used to say we didn't have a culture, but I've modified that today. I said we do have a culture. We have Africanisms in our culture today, but our culture is a reactionary culture. It is a culture that is built from trauma and, you know, living under an oppressive system. So, you know, the question I asked myself was, how do we create a culture of agency? What would it take for us to create that culture of agency? And so that's when I started really kind of studying culture and to do it. And then, you know, what makes people gravitate to certain aspects of culture versus others. So I didn't want to try to just take something from Africa and then try to impose it on us, because we're not Yoruba, we're not Asante, you know, we're an African people, but, you know, I don't want to misappropriate what they're doing. But I'm taking what I know we have already created here that is authentically us, and now let's frame it in a way that it can work for us, and we can institutionalize it and win some victories for African people, you know, utilizing our culture. So like, you know, hip hop is one of those, and jazz, that's a homegrown thing, right? But it's still grounded in African, you know, history, language, and culture. Right. So that, you know, so when presenting this to people, like every time you hear it, you can't but think of Africa and Africans, right, with it. But, you know, understanding that this is how the Ashe has manifested amongst the African Americans, you know, here in the United States. And then people in Brazil going to do what they do. And this is how the Ashe manifests, you know, to those folks. And we just come and we get together and we party, we share, and we exchange, and we build. And that's just, you know, the goal, you know, of all of these studies.
So like not only can it be an expression of culture, it can be a vehicle to understand the similar expressions throughout the diaspora.
Exactly. You know, so, you know, hopefully, you know, we can be a model for others to do the same amongst themselves. Right. Like how would they, what have they created in their space? And, you know, because of the transatlantic slave Holocaust, you know, they've lost the essential language, but they kept the underlying spirit. So how will they reconceptualize it in a way that works for them and introduce it to the world? You know, and so that's what I look forward to.
Yeah, man, that's extremely, extremely dope. I'm gonna have to get you back on so we can just dive into that some more. You know what I'm saying?
Indeed.
But for everybody, everybody knows you, but just in case there are people that are tuning in that want to know where to, you know, get your books or follow you on social media, if you can, let everybody know where to find your works.
Yes. Well, first and foremost, you can go to my website, asarimhotep.com. That's where you'll find all of my books. Or you can go to Indela Press, MADUNDELAPRESS.com, MaduIndelaPress.com. And so you'll find my books there, but you'll also currently find 2 additional works. One from Dr. Sylvain Colombo and Sacco, which I translated from French into English, called Prayer in Africa. And one of the latest books from Dr. Chilemalema Mukinge, called Muntu Wa Nzambi, Human as God's Special Creation. And we're getting ready to publish another book, where we're just at the beginning stages with Dr. Chilemalema Mukinge. And I'm also gearing up to do an edited work called Paths of Ma'at, essays in honor of Mubabinge Bilolo. And there'll be essays from other, researchers coming out of Africa and a few from the United States that know Dr. Bilolo, as well as myself. And so y'all be on the lookout for that as well. So, and then of course, YouTube, I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, and of course, Facebook. All of them is just find me as Asar Imhotep or Imhotep 1906 or 06. You'll find it. But Asar, I think I'm only Asar Imhotep for now. Yeah, so you just type in my name in those mediums, I'm sure to pop up.
Man, well, I definitely appreciate the time. It's been a pleasure building with you, man. Like, great conversation. And definitely, man, I would like to have you back on sometime, and, we'll discuss some other things.
Indeed. I look forward to it. And thank you again for having me.
Indeed, man. You have a good one, brother.
Appreciate it.